Hello friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history 1, 20th century, and today we will talk about imperialism and colonialism and the establishment of the empires during the medieval ages and in the later times. They have been discussed in different kinds of framework, and how imperialism and colonialism can also be distinguished, and how it was also in a phase where we find the capitalist tendencies. So capitalism and its phases, they have also been in a way enumerated by some of the scholars. So in the course of our discussion, we will try to in a way distinguish between imperialism and colonialism, and how the capitalist tendencies which were there, and how those kinds of phases of capitalism they were instrumental in that sense. And because nowadays we also talk about neo-imperialism in the framework of the development of the new transnational corporations, that how new kind of imperialism is there. So in this reference, when we talk about the kind of a process of the capitalist development which leads to the capitalist countries to conquer and dominate the pre-capitalist countries of the world, it has been seen in the framework of imperialism, and it is some kind of a system of political control which is exercised by the metropolis over the domestic and foreign policy, and over the domestic policies of another polity, which we shall call periphery, countries at the margins of the economic hierarchy. So in that sense, imperialism has to be understood in that particular context, and how it is also in a way used to designate the international practices and the relations of the capitalist world during the distinct stages of the mature capitalism that began in the last quarter of the 19th century. So largely when we tend to understand imperialism, then it is also seen in the framework of the kind of international practices, and how the relations of the capitalist world, they also existed, and how it was largely specific to the 19th century and thereafter. And we see that all these definitions, when we tend to understand them, the kind of references which they have, they firmly establish imperialism as an imperialism, some kind of a modern phenomena, and distinctly different from the pre-modern forms of conquest and political domination. So when we tend to understand them, we in a way realize that how imperialism is to be seen in a modern kind of a context, and how it is different from the pre-modern forms of the conquest and the political domination which was happening in the earlier times. And when we tend to understand the characteristics of imperialism, we find that there is a sharp increase in the international flow of commodities, man and capital. And it happened at that point of time. We find that how trade developed from 15th, 16th century onwards, and trade from east and west in large quantities developed during that time. And this kind of international flow could also be seen in the framework of men, as we see that the slave trade during this time could also be witnessed, and capital definitely was exchanging hands, whether in the framework of the bullion which was there, when the people, those who were coming from Europe, they were coming to the eastern part, they were getting bullion to purchase the commodities which they were taking from the east. And we also see that apart from this, the interdependent set of the relations between the countries at different levels of industrial development, that how countries which were at different levels of industrial development, they had this kind of an interdependent set of relations, that these kind of relations, they existed between them, and how they were trying to negotiate with those kinds of relations. And we also find that during this time, the superior and advanced technology could also be seen in the imperialist countries. We find that during this time, when developments were taking place in Europe in 15th, 16th centuries onwards, after Renaissance, Reformation, and thereafter we find that geographical discoveries, sea voyages, they also started, and Spain and Portugal being the dominant countries which were largely there in the trade, and we find that the kind of developments which were there in the shipbuilding and the kind of mechanisms which were required to make the ship journey smooth, because those were the main basis on which we find that trading networks they were established at that point of time, because you did not have the air traffic, or you did not and the road transport was not possible between different continents and different countries, as only sea route was available. So we find that these kinds of advances could also be noticed during this point of time, and especially the imperialist countries, we find that they had comparatively superior technology at that point of time. And we also find another important feature was in the framework of the competition between the advanced capitalist nations, that how the advanced capitalist nations they were also competing with each other, and how they wanted to outdo each other in terms of securing colonies, as they did after in the 17th and the 18th century. We find that how these nations they secured colonies in different parts of the world, and how these colonies were playing an important role in terms of providing all sorts of advantages to the mother country or the country which has colonized them. And when we talk about how imperialism in that sense was different from the empire, it is important to distinguish between the empire and imperialism in that sense that there were many empires in history, but an empire in an era of capitalism is imperialism. In an earlier era, tribute was the main motive, but we find that during the capitalist times, during the era of capitalism, in that sense, we realize that how it was playing an important role in terms of that particular period. But when you go to the earlier period, we find that tribute was the main important factor which was being given during the empire. And when we see that how the capitalism economies and societies of the conquered or the dominated areas, they were transformed, they were adapted and manipulated to serve the imperatives of the capital accumulation in the imperialist countries, and placed at the center of the economic hierarchy. So when you talk about the capitalist economies or the societies, and the societies which were being in a way taken over or dominated by the imperialist countries, we find that how these societies they were being transformed, they were being changed, and they were also being manipulated to serve the interest of the imperialist countries, because we see that the kind of crop pattern which was things which were being grown now in these dominated countries or the colonies, they were in a way were required by the mother country. And when you talk about imperialism versus colonialism, we find that there is a distinction between imperialism and colonialism which is very very important, and how the history of imperialism is different from the history of particular colonies as well. And we find that imperialism is specifically European phenomena, whereas colonialism is system which was prevalent in the colonies. So we find that how they are different in that sense, that how it was a European phenomena and colonialism is a system which was prevalent in the colonies. And it can also be argued that since European imperial history had a basic unity, therefore to study an empire in isolation would be pointless as well. And in that context, when we try to understand imperialism and we try to understand the features of imperialism and how it operated at that point of time, we realize that how imperialist nations they utilized their colonial regions or their colonies in the pursuit of their objectives or aims. And we also see, when you are trying to study imperialism, we try to examine the impact of the empire on the metropolis, whereas the colonialism refers to the impact on the colony. So in this way also we try to distinguish it, that how when we are trying to study imperialism, we examine the impact of the empire on the metropolis, whereas colonialism is in a way referring to the impact on the colony, the kind of changes which has come in the colony, they are being studied. And when you talk about the advantages of the empire to the mother country, it ranged from the colonial wealth which financed the industrial revolution to the evolution of the superior military technology, mechanisms of control such as army and bureaucracy. And when you talk about the kind of advantages which empire had to the mother country, then we find that how the kind of colonial wealth which they acquired and how this wealth was important in that sense in the framework of the industrial revolution, how it developed during that time, how that money was available to finance the industrial revolution, and how they were in a way trying to develop the military technologies, etc. So when we tend to understand imperialism in that way, we find that it operates in both formal and informal manner. And the formal imperialism involves the annexation and direct rule, while the informal empire means that indirect rule by the local elites who are independent legally but politically dependent on metropolis. So this kind of a distinction is also there between the formal and informal imperialism. And when we tend to understand that how the empires they operated, then we find that there were the three broad types of empires that have either existed in a linear chronology, one succeeding the other, or also coexisted with each other at a particular historical juncture. And when you talk about their kinds, types, then we find that the trading empires that took initiative in early conquest but eventually lost out in the era of industrial capitalism, such as Portugal and Spain. So these were the countries initially which we find that they dominated the trade, they took a lot of initiative at that point of time, and over a period of time their dominance was phased out. Britain was the most dominant country which emerged during this kind of a contest which was happening between these countries. So we basically see that how trading empires in that sense, both of them, they over a period of time lost out to the other empires like industrial empires like Britain and France, and how these Britain and France had so many colonies at their disposal. India being one of the most prized possessions of Britain, that how India was being looted for nearly 200 years by Britain, and all sorts of wealth from India was taken away. And we also find that if you even see British museums, you will find that most of the museums they have a lot of wealth from so many different nations. Their museums are in a way filled with the kind of artifacts which have been taken from their colonies, which have been acquired by them. And when you talk about the industrial empire, we find that how Britain and France, as Britain was the first country where we find the industrial revolution, and because of which it had a lot of advantage, and we find that when it became some sort of an industrial empire, then it was able to in a way meet its needs because of the kind of supplies which are coming from the colonies. And apart from that, the colonies were also serving as markets for the finished products which were made during this time. So we in a way understand that how colonies were serving an important role for them. And we also see that how the industrial empires without or with few formal colonies, such as Germany was a third kind of an empire. That Germany, when we tend to understand it, that how it had certain formal colonies and it did not have the kind of colonies which Britain and France had. And in this context, when we tend to understand them, we realize that they were kind of different eras. And in that particular framework, when we tend to understand them and when we try to in a way periodize them, the different kinds of periods which we have seen, and they can be seen in the framework of the stages. And these capitalism may be said to have gone through five stages or phases. And first one was the end of the 15th to the middle of the 17th century, and the rise of the commercial capitalism and the rapid growth of the world commerce. And second was the mid 17th to late 18th century. The commercial capital ripens into a dominant economic force. So we see that during this particular period, in the different stages, different kinds of developments they were taking place. And when we tend to analyze the end of the 15th to the middle of the 17th century, the rise of the commercial capitalism was happening during this particular period, and the world commerce was also rising in that sense, and a lot of trade was happening between different continents and different countries. And in the second in the later half of in the second stage, when we see the middle 17th to the late 18th century, we find that how as we have argued also, that the commercial capital which was there at the earlier part as well, how it became some sort of a dominant economic force, how it was to be used in that sense was an important development. And thereafter, from the late 18th to the 1870s, we find that that was the era of the industrial capital. And during this particular phase, we find that how goods which were being made in the advanced world or the developed world or the industrialized world, they required the raw materials, and these raw materials were going from the colonies. And thereafter we find that how they were able to make those goods, and these goods, they were being exported to the same countries, many of the countries which were in a way providing them the raw material, or they were also being exported to other countries which were serving as markets for these industrialized countries. Then we also see that 1880s to the First World War, where we find the rise of the monopoly capitalism or the monopoly capital, where the division of globe, etc., all these kinds of things, they were also happening, because the way Africa was being partitioned at that point of time in 1890s, and how we also see that it was also a period when the monopoly capitalism or monopoly capital was also rising in that sense. And we also in a way realize that if you see the post World War one period, then some kind of ideological initiatives could also be seen, whether in the framework of socialism, and the ideas of decolonization, they also emerged after the First World War as well. And the rise of the multinational corporations was another important development. So we find that when you talk about the stages of imperialism, then how they coincided with the stages of capitalism as well. And when you tend to understand them in the framework of what actually was happening around the world, whether the socialist developments which happened in 1917 in Russia, or even before that, that how these kinds of ideas, they were gaining some kind of prominence. And decolonization was an important aspect, that how different parts of the world, they were being colonized by these countries, and how what we have to see is that this kind of a decolonization takes place, where the countries, they were not, they did not even they did not become free from the direct foreign control, but at the same time the kind of institutions which were under the grip of imperialism and colonialism, they also had to be taken out of that kind of a grip. And the mindset had to be decolonized in that sense. And even now we talk about this kind of a decolonization, that decolonization not only means that how these countries, they came out from the other countries, they renounced, or rather they were being forced to in a way vacate their possessions in the colonies, but at the same time how the minds, they needed to be decolonized. And this we see this kind of phenomena is being discussed even now. And we also talked about the rise of the multinational corporations, that how the big giants, big companies, they in a way rose during this time. And especially this kind of a context could also be seen in the framework of the 1990s in India and thereafter, where we find that the rise of the multinational corporations could be seen, and these multinational corporations in a way are trying to protect or promote some kinds of values which are there in the society. And we see that when we tend to understand these kinds of stages, as I told you, they coincided with the stages of capitalism as well. And when one talks about the stages of capitalism, one can see that how stages of capitalism and the imperial powers, when you talk about merchant capitalism was one, and if you tend to understand Portugal and Spain, they were dominant at that point of time. Then industrial capitalism, when we talk about, then we talk about Britain, France and Netherlands. And when we talk about finance capitalism, then we talk about Britain, USA and Germany. So these are the three stages of capitalism as we could understand, and how the different imperial powers, how they were at that point of time trying to take the initiative in that sense. During the period of merchant capitalism, we find that Portugal and Spain, they were the most important imperial powers, and thereafter when you talk about imperial industrial capitalism, then we find that how Britain, France and Netherlands, all three of them, they were the developed countries from that perspective. And finance capitalism was one phase where we find that you talk about different kinds of monopolies, and how Britain, USA and Germany, all of them, they were the dominant countries at that point of time. So when we in a way try to understand imperialism, we also have to see the kind of development which was happening in the sphere of capitalism, and we will talk further about other important dimensions of imperialism in our next lecture. Thank you very much.